everyone, welcome to the next episode of Azure On Air. Today I have a very interesting guest, Pedro. He's a technical lead at Valtech and he's also a Microsoft Azure MVP. He's a public speaker and an Azure tech lead. So, with almost 30 years of experience in IT, he's been managing infrastructures ranging from small, mission critical to 1,000 plus user organizations. In the last few years, he has also worked in DevOps practices and as a cloud architect, leading teams to design and implement solutions across the Microsoft and AWS stacks, focusing on cloud first or hybrid scenarios. So, with a passion for technology, he's always looking for the next big thing because cloud is candy store and it never stops evolving. Also, we have this expert here who can explain us more on the real-time experiences that we had with the monitoring approaches for Azure. So I'm very happy to welcome Pedro here to our show today.
I'm not calling it monitoring, and nowadays I prefer to call it observability. Usually, engineers, when they start configuring monitoring, they start from the infrastructure to business. I always start from a top-down approach. Let's look at the three main components about the data collection. Hi, Amrita, and thank you for inviting me. Wonderful intro. Today my idea is to speak about observability. And let's start with that point. I'm not calling it monitoring, and nowadays I prefer to call it observability. The difference is probably if we define observability first, you'll understand why I do this. So for me, observability is the ability to understand what's happening with a complex system, and you do that by gathering data from various sources, right? Like logs, metrics, traces, and more. So this gives a broader sense of what observability is instead of monitoring. If you consider, for instance, that your infrastructure and you look at it like it's a pyramid, right? And at the bottom you have your infrastructure and at the top you have business. Usually engineers, when they start configuring monitoring, they start from the infrastructure to business, so they use a bottom-up approach. What I'm trying to advocate in the past few years is engineers should think the opposite way. So we should think about a top-down approach. We should first consider what are the business needs, what brings value, what brings money to your company, right? And for business, what they need is just like a semaphore, and you see, is my workloading working or not? Is it green, red, or yellow? If it's yellow, well, there's a warning there, but I can continue to do business, right? And then the technicians, the engineers, should focus on what is giving that warning. But if it's green, everything is working. I have business continuity and I have revenue. So I always start from a top-down approach. Okay, and there's some wonderful documentation on Microsoft Azure Monitor and all of the bits and pieces that take part of this. Um, but let's think about some core principles. So first, you have your data sources. So where the data comes from. Is it logs? Is it metrics? Is it traces? And then you need to gather that information in a central point. And for instance, on Azure, because we're talking about Azure, log analytics workspace is where you usually gather all of this information. And from there, you need to show the information, you need to present the information. And for that, you build visuals, and the visuals can be Azure Monitor, you can use Managed Grafana, you can use workbooks, Power BI, wherever. Also, from that data that you gather, you need to configure your alerts. And those alerts trigger actions or trigger incident response actions to the teams. All of this ecosystem, you look at it, and from the information that you gather, you also get information that allows you for a continuous improvement. So This is not something that you set up once and you just set and forget. No, this is something that you should revisit. You should look into it and take the opportunities to improve your system. And your systems are also evolving, right?
Yeah.
Um, Today you have a web app, tomorrow you create a new web app. And so you have differences. Your databases grow and your data grows, and that also brings changes to what you're observing, right? So it's a continuous improvement, it's a continuous involvement from the engineers with the systems they manage.
Yeah. So in that case, you just gave me a flow right now, right? I was just thinking about that flow: data collection, visualization, alerting, and then the final response, right? So in that case, can you just explain them a bit detailed? Say, let's take data collection. Can you just give me a quick explanation on that? Like, what are the prerequisite? How it's to be done?
Well, that's a very good question, Amrit, and thank you for asking. Let's look at the three main components about the data collection, right? So you have logging, you have metrics, you have tracing. And for each of these, you have some key points which are important. For instance, for logging, what you need is structured logging. So your logs need to have a structure so that you can then query and then create the metrics, create the alerts on top of it, and then create the visuals on your logging. Also, the right level of logging. So do I need error, information, warning, debug? Depending on the system, you might want a log to be more verbose or less verbose. And this also has impact on the queries that you do later on and also on the costs because the amount of data you store on a log analytics workspace will also impact the cost of your solution, right? These are key aspects that you need to focus on logs. On metrics, for instance, it's also important to focus on the right metrics. And depending on of the workload that you're monitoring, depending on how what kind of resources you're using, then you have different metrics, right? For instance, let me give you an example. If you're monitoring a virtual machine, usually you have uh, things like bandwidth, in and out, you have memory, you have CPU, right? And I see people, for instance, defining, let's touch on the thresholds now. I see people defining thresholds on memory for, I want an alert at 80% of memory, right? But is that the right threshold for that metric? It depends on the workload because if you have a database inside that VM, the database will consume whatever memory it can, right? So probably it will be higher than 80%. If it is another type of workload, some process running there, um, it could spike over that threshold of 80% or CPU 90 or 95%, but also depends on the amount of time that it spikes, right? If it's a short time, you can consider it a spike. If it's continuous for 1 hour, 2 hours, depending on what's running, right? So I think this is really important. The same with traces. When you want distributed tracing, you want, for instance, if you have a web app and that a web app communicates with an API, communicates with a database, with some kind of identity provider, you need to identify the flow. So we need to trace and distribute it, trace all over your system. And for that, it's really important that you use something like unique identifiers and contextual information that allows you to follow that flow from beginning to the end.
Yeah. So in that case, I hope it's similar with the visualization and the next part of the flow. Can you just elaborate a little bit on the next part of the flow?
Well, visualization, it's interesting that you mentioned this because again, we engineers tend to have, we love graphs, right? We love a dashboard with a lot of information. But if you present that information, for instance, for business analysts, They don't care about your bandwidth usage. They don't care about if a database is processing X or N queries. What they want to see is how the system is behaving. How many users do I have at that moment on my system? How many transactions am I able to do? What's my revenue? What's my cost? Right? So when you create your visuals, you should understand that there are different necessities, different needs, depending on who's using that visual. So it's important for you to identify the right data that you want to show. And also, in some areas, it's needed that you create custom metrics that combine other metrics, that you gather and transform information to show it on the proper way, right? What I usually say is use the KISS principle. So keep it simple, right? Keep it simple. And also the way that you show the visuals, a graph, a gauge, they have different perspectives, and you can see the same data on a different way.
So, like you mentioned this, I also want to know about how this particular observability flow impacts a business. So, what are the outcomes that we derive by following these?
Well, the impacts for business is it's simple to explain, right? Business analysts, they are our face, our advocates within our company to the customer, right? And they are there to help us technicians understand what is the value of our workloads to the company and to the customers. So instead of and I see this a lot in the past. It's like the DevOps culture, right? In the past, we had operations and we had developers and we had that gap in the middle, right? Just think about observability. We used to have the gap with business analysts and the technicians and the engineers. And I think we need to bring to this area the same principles that we use with DevOps. So they are our closest friends to the customer, right? They understand what are the business needs, and is our role to work with them so that they help us translate those business needs into the observability. And that's why I always start top to bottom, right? First, talk with the analysts, first understand the business, and then drill down on the layers.
Excellent. So, while speaking about the flow, I just had this previous question because of the visualization part. But now coming back to the flow, can I also have an idea about the alerts and notification? So, how does that also reflect in the incident response?
In this area, you have teams that are responsible for responding to alerts, right? And it's really important that you start by defining who are those teams and when should they be alerted and when should they act on something, right? And from that, it's also important that you identify the proper metrics that you want to measure and that you set clear thresholds of alerting. The last thing we want is people that receive tons of emails from alerting or messages or whatever system you use. After some time, they will just disregard those alerts. So have the proper balance between when is it really important to alert someone and to be acting on something, and what is just information that should be filtered from the teams. That's one part. The other part is when you have an alert, that alert can fire multiple times in a short amount of time. That's called flapping. So reducing the noise, reducing the flapping is also important, because we don't want a team that's actively doing something because of an alert being bombarded with other alerts of the same type or related alerts, right? Um, Lastly, you have to test. And there are some times of the day when we humans are more distracted, like for instance, lunchtime, end of the day. Those are kind of good moments to test your alerts and to test if the teams are looking actively looking at that and they respond. You should do planned tests, and you should also do unplanned tests, and sometimes fire an alert when people are not well, when they are not aware of it.
So that's a good advice as well from your end, Pedro. So now I have this question out of curiosity, because I didn't plan this before the session, but I now have it because in my industry I see a lot of people migrating from on-premise to Azure.
Hmm.
So they're moving from on-premise to cloud. At this point in stage, when should they be educated about this observability? Right in the beginning, or like you said, it's the top to bottom approach,
Yeah.
right? So, how does this work for the people who are migrating to Azure?
Well, I would say the principles are the same, right? What we are speaking is observability, either it's on-prem or on the cloud. So the principles are the same for both scenarios. If you're going to do a lift from on-prem to Azure, you can integrate easily on the Azure side. You can integrate with what you already have on-prem, or you can also take the advantage of leveraging the cloud benefit, leveraging Azure to redesign the way that you do observability for the cloud and also on-prem. Because I know we are speaking about Azure, we're speaking about cloud, but Azure Monitor also allows you to do the same kind of monitoring on-prem. So I would say, replying to your question, I would consider this one of the first things that you also need to think about, right?
So, like coming to the end of the session, so I would like to let you know that the specific podcast is specifically for the Azure beginners. So, what would be the advice from you for the beginners who are planning to utilize Azure or to learn Azure? What would be your piece of advice for them?
Well, I would suggest that you look at, for instance, the cloud challenges that you have on Microsoft Learn. Also, there's some really good modules there about observability and other areas of Azure. Also, because, well, here in Portugal, I'm one of the organizers of the Azure User Group Portugal, and we do regular meetups, some of them in English, and online, so you can attend. But I would say search for your local meetup groups. Probably you'll find a group there with people, some more knowledge, and where you can share experiences, where you can learn from others and get some advice on specific areas that you need to improve. Lastly, you have to practice. So you have to do stuff. Just looking at modules and learning from modules, talking to people doesn't teach you how to do stuff. You need to properly go to Azure and start kicking the tires and experiment and understanding stuff.
Yeah, so that was amazing hearing from you. So, thank you for your time in our show, Pedro. It was a brilliant session. So, I had a lot of knowledge, not in depth, but maybe I had glimpses of what it is and how observability can help business as well. So, once again, we thank you, and we also look forward to have more sessions with you.
Cove.co